Hi everyone, some gamer dude here. A few weeks back I got a request on one of my Casual Fight Friday episodes for a deck tech on my Rezzard deck. I haven't made a deck tech video in ages, about 2 years, but I agreed to it. I should note here, since that video of Casual Fight Fridays, I have modified the deck quite significantly and it feels much more capable now. I'll do something new and end this video with a game of the deck in action. So what is Rezzard trying to do? Simple. It's a control reanimation deck with light ramp. Set up graveyard, kill their dudes, force them to kill the dudes you can't kill, maybe gain some life, smash face. It's a fun, synergistic deck. So let's start with the ruler, Rezzard. Rezzard is a Darkness Wind human ruler with a stranger deck and a judgment cost of Wind, Darkness, Darkness. When you play a Darkness Regalia, you can choose one of the listed effects. If it's Deathscythe, you choose 2 instead. 1. Mill the top 2 cards of your stranger deck. That's the one you will always choose, as this is a reanimation deck. 2. Each player banishes a resonator. This one can have its uses if you set up your field for it prior, but it's not common that you will be in a position till later in the game. Doing it early most of the time will result in some lost momentum and giving up a resonator you don't want to. 3. Put a resonator from your grave into your hand. This one again is more of a late game thing. Since you pick all the options at once, you don't know if what's going into your graveyard is something you want in hand. But later in game, both of these effects become much better, especially if one of your key cards that isn't worth reanimating, Raya, ends up in the discard pile and you draw into a Deathscythe instead. Finally, 4. You can pay 0 to cast Judgment for the duration of the turn. Most of the time, you just want that mill and to have Deathscythe on board. As a J-Ruler, Rezzard becomes a 1000/1000 7 Kings vampire. When he enters, he mills you 4 from your main deck, then resurrects a vampire from the grave and makes it a Darkness vampire in addition to whatever else it is. This is great on base value. Free body can resurrect anything you want, use enter effects, but both Rezzard and Raya have vampire synergy. His God's Art, Blood Revolution, costs Darkness and Wind and does quite a bit. It's also poorly worded in my opinion, but here's how it works. Your vampires gain +400/+400 for the turn. Then each of your vampires, starting from the strongest and ending with the weakest, targets an opponent's resonator and deals damage to them equal to their attack. While I do have a couple of vampires in here, most of the time it'll just be Rezzard and whatever he resurrects. But still, 2 kills for Darkness Wind. Pretty good. However, it can get better if they have Drain, so you gain life off of this. Or they have Bane, so they just kill the target anyway. This is because of the wording. The resonator is dealing the damage, triggering both Bane and Drain. Blood Revolution is something you'll use in a clutch, but it's fairly useful. I mentioned Deathscythe, so I'll cover that next. Deathscythe is a Wind Darkness Regalia for Darkness Wind. It has Mythic, so you can only have 1 out, but you can play another for the triggered abilities on Rezzard, and the one already in play will be sent to the grave. Deathscythe can be tapped to produce any combination of 2 Wind and Darkness Will that can only be used to pay for God's Art, Mage Art, cards from the grave, and abilities from the grave. You can also remove 3 cards in your grave to return it to your hand from the grave, which has some applications, but less so now with Prelude to Ataraxia. Your main use here is the 2 Will ramp for all but one of our chants, a few things in the grave, and the triggered abilities of your ruler. Saying that, I'm becoming of the opinion that the early play of Deathscythe for ramp and graveyard setup is a bit situational. Other cards that can be tutored from the deck can set up the grave without wasting any of Rezzard's triggered effects. Rezzard's effects have a decent amount of versatility, but aren't always advantageous. You might actually need them later, especially if Raya ends up in the grave. It really depends on the rest of your hand. I'll get into this later. Before I commence with the rest of the deck, I think it's best to go over the stranger deck since Rezzard wants them in the grave. First up is Black Wizard, a 600/600 Darkness Stranger Resonator with Bane for Darkness. Everything about that is irrelevant because of his actual body of text. While in the grave, and only during your turn, he can produce a Darkness Will, an Undead mana dork. It's one of 2 cards you really want in the grave as soon as possible. It's literally free will that most people can't get rid of, and we run protection for the grave anyway. The other card I typically want in the grave ASAP is Faust, the Promising Warrior, a 1400/1400 Darkness Wind Resonator with Bane and Drain for Wind Darkness Darkness 1. He's got a fun couple of abilities. While he's in the grave, you can pay Darkness to give one of your Resonators a promise counter. When that Resonator hits the grave, Faust rises from the grave. Since we do things to sack our own guys, it's super easy to trigger this guy out. Repeatedly too. At 14/14 with Bane, your opponent might be selective on how they block him, but you gain 1400 life most turns he swings, lowering how many times per turn you have to block. It's synergy for a big bulky body with a great couple of keywords. Even if you just give a counter out to something you send out and basically threat with it, if it dies, Faust comes out. It's still a great card. I genuinely like Faust. Astema, Fallen Angel of Desolation, is surprisingly better than she looks here. She's a 1000/1000 Darkness Resonator with Flying and Drain for 3 Darkness. At the start of both players' turns, that player must sack a non-Fallen Angel Resonator. Now, we can cope with that. We have things in the grave that can keep resurrecting. Opponent? Not so much. This is a great way to thin their field. Plus, it gets around barrier. Your opponent chooses. You can, through kill spells, force them to sack things you can't kill. Plus, Flying and Drain. More life. Enjoy not needing to block much. Raya, the Twilight Witch, is a 400/400 Darkness Resonator for 2 Darkness. When she enters the board, you can remove target Resonator, and she gains the stats of that Resonator. Not a terribly complex card, but more removal, bigger bod. It's fairly normal for her to reach above 1000/1000. The final slot is a tad difficult. You could splash in things for the intent of resurrection, but can't cast them from the hand. If for whatever reason they end up in your hand, they're dead. I don't like that. I had Jabberwock, the chaotic disaster, here for a while, but I never wanted to use it because it's so inconsistent. In recent games, I used Anubis, the Guardian of the Throne, but as I played with the deck more, returning cards like Raya to my hand if she ends up in the grave seemed less beneficial as I wanted to play Deathscythe later anyway. I can return her off the back of Deathscythe. Ultimately, I came to Zane, the Warrior of Condemnation. Zane is an 800/800 Darkness Wind Resonator with Bane and Quick Cast for Darkness Wind. We have a bit of a board wipe in the deck, and that's where Zane comes into play. Zane's Enter allows you to draw a card for each Resonator put into the grave that turn. Again, I'll talk about it more later, but let's just put it here now. You'll likely draw around 4 to 5 cards off this skill. Bane here is just gravy. So let's get to the main deck and its star. Mikage Raya is by far the most important component of the deck, as she enables basically everything we do. It's to such a point that I'd argue a 5-card mulligan is not an unwise decision if you don't draw into her, as she can single-handedly set up some very strong plays. She is that good of a card. Raya is a 400/400 Darkness Vampire with Flying and Quick Cast for Darkness. When she enters, she searches your deck for a Darkness card and chucks it into the grave. She can also give all vampires Drain, and if she is banished due to the cost or by the effect of one of your mage arts, she goes into your hand from the grave. She is effectively 3 cards in one, and all 3 effects are extremely useful. Very nearly the entire deck uses her as a springboard. It's also worth remembering she has Quick Cast, so if you want to wait to cast her and tell your opponent is out of resources on their turn 1, before you recover your magic stones for your second turn, it's a good call. When you play Raya, you have two very real choices for your first dump. The first is Sigurd, the Covenant King. An 800/800 zombie king for Wind Darkness, he can only be played from the graveyard, which is meant to imply but doesn't correctly state that it can only be cast from the grave. He gives zombies Bane, and when he comes out, you search your deck for a Darkness edition with a cost of 2 or less and place it onto the board. Like Raya, he's multiple cards in one, but we're only looking for that synergy with Raya, being played from the grave and grabbing a Darkness edition. I personally think it's a little understated just how useful Sigurd's first effect is, since people focus so much on the third. So long as he doesn't get removed, bounced, or otherwise put in your hand somehow, you always have a cheap attacker and blocker with decent stats. He dies, just cast him again. Same if you need to pay a sacrificial cost and don't have Raya. He's just 2 and can be ramped into via Deathscythe. That's pretty neat. It's also worth noting that by the time you Raya into Sigurd, you've pulled 2 cards out of your deck. Each time you use Raya or Sigurd, so long as they have valid targets, you make it easier to draw specific cards you want in hand. It's deck thinning. Sigurd's big controversy is just how much he enables with that addition search. I kind of think Raya is the problem here, since she enables Sigurd. Sigurd is definitely nowhere near as good without Raya. You'll need a way to dump him from hand to grave without Raya to do it from the deck. But a great deal of the ire is for the New Frontiers format and a card called Sacrificial Altar. It's starting to come into Alice Origins cluster format now through our next card, the Road to the Undead Lord. The Road to the Undead Lord is Rezzard's Road edition from Prelude to Adaraktia. When it's played, if Rezzard is your ruler, mill 2 of your Stranger deck. While it's in play, cards in your grave can't be targeted. This is why it's not really necessary to play Deathscythe super early. You can and should Raya into Sigurd into Road, then later Deathscythe so you can grab something that might be in your grave that you want, namely Loria or Astema, or alternatively force both players to sack a Resonator. Sack Sigurd, then cast him again via Deathscythe, tutor that other Road, setting up the grave again, or grabbing our next card. The grave protection won't always be relevant, but there is a direct counter to Rezzard that exists in the format. The chain into milling the Stranger deck is the real boon here. 2 shots at both Faust and Black Wizard, more so if you chain Deathscythe into Sigurd into a second copy of Road. At that point you've milled 6 and probably should have 1 of everything you need in the grave. The second target for Sigurd is Curse of Credaceous. A Darkness edition for Darkness, Curse stops your opponent from gaining life or recover entities outside of the recovery phase. It can also be rested to drain your opponent of 200 life. Curse is mostly used here for preventative measures. Steadily drain your opponent of life, and as another target for Sigurd. A part of True Power is a Wind Darkness Magi chant with Remnant for Wind and Darkness. As an additional cost, you must sack a Resonator. Hello Raya, but its effect is to resurrect a Darkness Resonator. Hello Raya again. If you have a part of True Power in your opening hand, this is where Raya's second target comes into play. You can hold off Sigurd for a turn, get a better payoff from a part of True Power in the short term, then go into Sigurd anyway since Raya will be back in your hand, allowing you to do it. The second target for Raya is Griffin Crossing the Darkness, a card that was a problem back when it was originally released in the Lapis cluster with the same cheating it into play theme. A 1200/1200 Darkness Wind Flying Chimera for Darkness Wind 4. When he enters the field, you get 2 magic stones. 2 stone ramp on a huge flying body. That's it. That 2 stone ramp is a huge amount of ramp though, especially turn 2. I have a 4-drop Resonator here. You'll be able to cast it on your 3rd turn with a magic stone to spare. On the turn you go True Power into Griffin, you will have 2 will to spare, 1 after the very likely play of Raya again. The Sigurd play is still very strong, but you have a ton of options on your turn 1. Your only real limitation is drawing Raya herself, which has an opening chance of 42%, 60 with the average mulligan of 3, and 70 if you chuck your whole hand out. But this is one of 2 big flaws with the deck. If you stall on Raya, you can't do much. You'll likely have to hope you get Deathscythe instead, and go Rezzard to mill yourself 4, resurrect something, and go into the God's Art to clear the board. This might be too slow on your turn 3, however. The End of Friendship is another card that interacts with Raya and Sigurd. A Wind Darkness quick cast Mage Chant for Wind and Darkness. It has an additional cost of sacking a Resonator. Your opponent banishes 2 Resonators. With all the other kill in this deck, it's really easy to limit their options to things you otherwise can't kill thanks to Barrier. It's good for board clearing, and you don't really lose anything, even if it's a bit costlier than it looks. Related to the true End of Friendship is Moan of the Dead, a Darkness quick cast Mage Chant for Darkness. You can sack a Resonator instead of paying the cost. It then kills a Resonator with a total cost equal to or less than the amount of cards in your grave. Very easy to set up there to all relevant numbers. Finally, you mill a Stranger, so it helps set up the grave and makes the next one a little stronger. Though past 6, you're not really making any new targets. Moan is also good for another reason. It's free. If they target your Raya or Sigurd with, say, a Schrodinger's Cry, which would remove it, you can just sack them to make Cry fizzle. Maybe hit one of their cards too. It's a neat alternate defensive usage of Moan. I didn't mention it earlier, since End of Friendship and Moan are probably the best cards to chain these effects, but if you give Sigurd or Raya the promise counter from Faust, you can combo that sack into Faust, ending up with that big boy on the board. Necromancer might seem like a strange choice. I think it's meant to be a counter for Rezzard, but it actually works out pretty well for him. A 700/700 Darkness Wind minion for 2 Darkness and a Wind. When she enters, she removes all Resonators from target player's grave and gains a +100/+100 counter for each one. This will always be your opponent, as you don't want them to be able to resurrect their grave off your effects. Given you have a 2-stone ramp built into the deck, and Deathscythe is another 2 will ramp for Mage Arts, getting to 7 Darkness Wind will isn't hard. We want that much will if we're going to clear their board. Mikage Seijiro's Game of Dreams is a Darkness Wind Mage Art chant for 2 wind and 2 darkness. Both players resurrect their grave, then banish all Resonators that weren't revived by this effect. Necromancer clears out their grave, so you get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir! Even if you don't clear them out with Necromancer, depending on the situation, you may still damage their board state. Game of Dreams is also the reason why I'm packing Zane, the Warrior of Condemnation. Get him in the grave, resurrect him with Game of Dreams. He enters the stack. Game resolves and banishes everything else. Then Zane gives you a card for each Resonator that went to the grave. You might actually have to be careful not to mill yourself here, but I don't think it's a real problem. You don't really Game of Dreams all that much. It's a clutch card, and even then, we do have a way to stop Zane, especially double Zanes, drawing you out. Mikage Seijiro is that 4-cost Resonator I was talking about earlier. A 1200/1200 Darkness Wind Vampire with Flying and Precision for 1 wind and 3 darkness. Surgero is another way to deal with threats. When he comes out, you can pay any amount of life to have him deal that much damage to another Resonator, which plays into Raya giving him Drain, so you get that life back. Then if something dies in the same turn that he damaged it, you get it on your field and it's a Darkness Vampire in addition to the rest of its attributes and races. Finally, he can remove strangers from your grave to gain Eternal. That last effect is good if he gets targeted and you have both Zanes in the grave. By the by. It won't be relevant terribly often though. Seijiro is admittedly a personal choice of mine, but I really like him. Plays into Raya well, not actually lose life, and potentially gain a lot. With precision, he gains the ability to kill things that can't be targeted by traditional removal, things that have barrier. Precision is one of my favourite keywords. If you revive him with Rezzard's J-Ruler Enter ability, that's another kill and potentially another vampire before Rezzard does Blood Revolution. If you Blood Revolution that turn, it has the potential to board wipe everything they have that lacks barrier, give you a ton of life, and 2 new Resonators. He is a personal choice, but I really like him. This slot can go either way. Currently I have Black Moonray here to kill J-Rulers, but it's not that relevant most games. I think it might be worth having in the side deck. I do sometimes find myself with Sigurd, a card that can't be cast from the hand, or Griffin, a card I don't want to cast from the hand. For that reason, I think having a couple of Soul Hunt is worth the time. Soul Hunt is a darkness chant for darkness that causes both players to banish a Resonator and discard a card. It's now also a mage art. Pitch Sigurd or Griffin, sack your Raya, or better yet, have nothing out while they do. They sack a guy and discard a card. Take them down too, set yourself up. If you don't want to go with that choice, Pharesia the Virtuous Vampire is a decent option for this slot. A Darkness Wind 600/600 5 heroes vampire with flying and barrier for Darkness Wind. Her whole gimmick is pitching cards. Pitch a Wind, a Resonator gains +400/+400 for turn. Pitch a Darkness, a Resonator loses -400/-400 for the turn. If you pitch a dual colour card, you get both effects. She also costs only a Darkness or Wind if you control another 5 heroes that isn't Pharesia, which isn't really relevant here. Another vampire for Raya and Rezzard, a discard out for Griffin and Sigurd. Whatever you choose for this slot, it's a fine choice. Priestess of the Black City is a 600/1000 Darkness human for Darkness 2. She costs -1 for each stranger in your grave, so she's pretty much always just Darkness for a casting cost. Her Enter ability allows you to cast strangers from the grave. Since they're cast from the grave, Deathscythe can pay for them. Usually this is just as Stemma and Loria, but both have their uses. Zane can be relevant here, though I think the best you might get is 3 draws, typically off the End of Friendship, which isn't the worst use of 5 will. 2 kills, 3 draws, 1 card down total. Awakening of the Undead Lord is the final main deck card, and truth be told, I don't think I've ever cast it. Awakening is a Darkness Wind quick cast mage art chance for Wind Darkness. It's a modular card with 3 choices. Deal 400 damage to every Resonator on the board, gain life equal to the amount of damage dealt. If Raya is going to be removed or killed by an effect, worthwhile choice. Just kill her yourself. Everything else takes 400 damage, you gain a ton of life. Not hard to gain 2000 plus off of this. 2. Banish any number of Resonators. Draw that many cards. Now, this one is nifty. Again, if your guys are getting removed or your opponent is killing them, get to them first. Draw the cards. It's also interesting here that you can nuke your own board, draw a bunch of cards, then go into Game of Dreams, kill their board, revive your entire grave, and hopefully have enough to kill whatever they bring back, if anything's in there. Finally, you can create a Darkness Zombie Resonator token with X attack and X defense, where X is the amount of cards in your grave times 100. Not the first choice I'd make, but what would typically be about 800 for 2, same as Sigurd, isn't the worst. I may never have used it, but I still think it's worth having. Finally, the Magic Stone deck. Adoraktia's Memoria, Magic Stone of Silence, and Darkness Magic Stone. Just a really basic setup. You could go into 3 colours, I just value consistency. Here is the list. It's a really enjoyable deck. The synergy is a ton of fun. I'm just going to leave you now with a game of my most recent build. This has been Some Gamer Dude, and thanks for watching.